Welcome back. My name is Stephanie Austin, and in this session, we'll be discussing assessing adaptation options. We've already talked about identifying potential adaptation options. So the goal now of an adaptation assessment is to select but also prioritize the most appropriate adaptation options for your given context or for your project. Choosing which adaptation option or options to implement when we usually have limited resources available is essentially a resource allocation challenge, which I'm sure you've already experienced in your work already. The basic question is essentially how much should be invested in which adaptation option or options and when, so that we can have the highest benefit at reasonable cost and within the available budget. Criteria-guided decision-making can help answer these kinds of questions and at the same time support transparency over the decisions made and how adaptation options were selected, and accountability. We'll talk more about accountability during a later session on monitoring and evaluation. Some of the most common forms of criteria-guided decision-making in this context for economic assessment of adaptation are cost-effectiveness analysis, cost-benefit analysis, and multi-criteria analysis. So before we look at each of these in turn, a key point to remember is that the way that criteria are selected and used in your adaptation assessment will influence the final result. So the first approach we'll talk about is cost-effectiveness analysis. So in basic terms, cost-effectiveness analysis determines how a goal can be achieved in the most cost-efficient way. Cost-effectiveness analysis may be used if it's impossible to assign a monetary value to the benefits of adaptation options. In cost-effectiveness analysis, you'll need to carefully choose a different unit of analysis to measure the benefits with then. So for example, it could be the area of pristine forest protected in a conservation program. If it's possible to quantify the benefits monetarily, then a cost-benefit analysis might be used instead. So let's look at that. A cost-benefit analysis is essentially an assessment of which adaptation measures have the most benefits and the lowest costs. Before starting, you'll need to define who the relevant stakeholders are, what your system of interest is, for example, whether it's the national infrastructure sector or one specific dam project, and you'll also need to define what time frame you're analyzing. These are really important because a measure can have a positive cost-benefit ratio for one stakeholder on the short term, but not for the whole society on the long term. In a cost-benefit analysis, you can actually differentiate between direct costs and benefits. So a direct costs are directly needed to implement the measure. These could be, for example, initial investments to implement the adaptation measures, or it can be for operation and maintenance over time. A residual cost could be costs that are not directly linked to implementing a measure, but might, for example, affect the society or nature negatively that weren't planned as part of the project. Direct benefits are directly linked to the intended goals of the measure and could be, for example, cost saving from reduced damages to the infrastructure investment. Co-benefits then are added benefits that go beyond the direct benefits. So for example, if your measure involved planting trees, well, a co-benefit could be having cleaner air from the planted trees. Not all costs and benefits can be assessed monetarily, so you might also have to bring in some alternative methodologies for the assessment. So for example, bringing in some expert judgment. The third approach that we'll talk about now is multi-criteria analysis. So multi-criteria analysis is a decision-making tool designed for really complex multi-dimensional problems. You might want to use this when certain aspects have to be assessed both qualitatively and quantitatively, or when there are several or kind of unclear project goals. And you can choose which criteria makes the most sense for your context. So the OECD suggests, for example, using criteria like effectiveness, or costs, or feasibility. But there are many other criteria that you could use. So for example, political and social acceptance, the urgency, how rapidly you could have the results, a no regrets option, and alignment with funding opportunities and requirements. So now we've been through 3 different approaches to adaptation assessment, and I know it can be a little bit confusing thinking about all 3 of these. So we've got this nice flowchart here to help answer the question of when do you use which methodology. So you can ask yourself, do I have one objective? Are the impacts measurable? And are the benefits in monetary terms? If the answer to all of these is yes, you may wish to use a cost-benefit analysis. If the answer is no, then you can ask yourself, do you have one objective? Are the impacts measurable, but the benefits are not in monetary terms? If the answer to these are yes, then you may wish to do a cost-benefit analysis. If the answer was no, you can ask yourself, are there multiple objectives or criteria? Are the impacts measurable? Or are the benefits not in monetary terms? If the answer is yes, you may wish to do a multi-criteria analysis. If the answer was no, and the impacts are really quite difficult to quantify, then you may wish to do a multi-criteria analysis, but also bring in an expert panel. So thank you very much for your time and attention. I hope you enjoyed this session, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.